George Eliason on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm your host, George Eliason. Welcome back. Today we've got a special interview with Dr. Ravasi, who's an international security expert, as well as the founder for Serbs for Trump 2020. Now, this group organized the Serbian-American diaspora in America into a solid pro-Trump vote for the 2020 elections in the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. In 2016, when the tight election results are looked at, it was the Serbian-American vote that provided Donald Trump with the edge he had in those swing states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and that resulted in his surprise victory over HRC. That slight margin was a victory of 78,000 votes, and it fell within, at that point, an unorganized but deeply ingrained anti-Clinton sentiment vote because she takes credit for U.S. NATO and NATO involvement in the Balkan Wars. Dr. Ravasi, thank you for coming on the show.
Good morning, George. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
I'm so happy to have you here with me. Good morning. Now, I introduce you, okay, in terms of, two of the hats that you wear as an international security expert and the founder for Serbs for Trump. Now, until this point in 2016, for the election, is it true that Serbian-Americans were solidly blue state voters?
Well, some were not. That depends pretty much historically on the different waves of immigration that you've had within the American Serb community. And you have several generations of American Serbs who obviously were born here. Somebody I spoke to not too long ago, his great-grandfather came here in 1903. So again, depending on the trajectory of the events in the Balkan region, you've had different immigration waves. And based on those, that is how, I guess, the token fell in terms of the division between Serbs who felt that they were conservative and Republican, and then some of those who were Democrat. Now, historically, if you look at some of these areas of blue-collar steel workers like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, like Indiana, Illinois, you have those immigrants who did grow up under the old Democrat Party, but that was the party of the JFK that is really, truly no longer. We all understand that that party has transformed completely and has really left their own voters and moved so far left. So Serbs in general are not monolith and they are not homogenous. So I wouldn't say that they were solidly blue, simply because, again, if you look at the Orthodox Christian tradition within the American Serb community, of course, there's more conservatives there. And on top of it, if you look at the immigration wave after World War II, which was mostly anti-communist and anti-fascist or anti-Nazis, because at that time you had both of those emerging, and Serbs weren't really flocking to either one. Those immigrants here that were royalists and belonged to the royalist Serbian army or royalist Yugoslav army at the time are mostly conservative. So there is certainly that division within the community, but I think what happened in 2016, as you rightly pointed out, and I think even a lot of what we know today in terms of those districts swinging towards President Trump against Hillary Clinton, the Serbs didn't really know what they were getting into with President Trump in 2016, but they certainly knew what they were getting into, God forbid, if Hillary Clinton won that presidency. And that was the major motivator for them to sort of in an unorganized fashion, but spontaneously go out and swing those districts.
Now, what drove that anti-Clinton sentiment so deep?
So as you yourself mentioned, her involvement in the Balkans at the time, obviously she was Bill Clinton's wife. And from everything that I have gathered over my years of political engagement and in my conversations actually with people who were very close to the Clinton administration at the time, it was almost as though he was the very last one to sign on for this intervention. If you remember at that time, obviously the Monica Lewinsky scandal was happening, but it was Madeleine Albright and Sandy Berger, and then ultimately Hillary Clinton, who was, a jaded wife at the time, that actually pushed Bill Clinton overboard. And later on, as you point yourself, she actually kept taking credit for the bombing. And you will remember her infamous lies, I would say, about landing in a Bosnian airport under sniper fire. And people just truly understood what kind of a war-hungry hawk she was. And that was the major motivator, because then again, from the 1990s, you have watched Hillary Clinton sort of develop into this politician that really has never seen a war that she didn't like many of her predecessors on both sides, I have to say. So certainly that was the major driving factor for the American Serb community to flock to those polls and just go for something new. And that was President Trump.
Now, in 2016, is this why Hillary Clinton stayed away from those crucial swing states during the campaign?
I am not so certain if that was the primary reason for her to stay away, simply because I think even with yourself and myself and people who were looking at this, I don't think we were very certain at that point what was going to happen. If you look at the timing from the primaries into the election, we really didn't know what was going to be driving those states. It was a big unknown, and we didn't really understand whether people would spontaneously almost organize on their own and flock to the polls. So I don't know if her camp really had the, as they say, finger on the temperature of the districts, but clearly something made her stay away, and she understood that there was a sentiment, very strong sentiment, that was not going in her favor. I am not so certain whether she could pinpoint, or her camp at that time, that it was mainly driven by the American Serb constituents. But certainly there was something to be said afterwards, once we actually sat down and analyzed what took place. So I think that is one of those factors that going forward, we must, and I personally did, take into consideration.
Now, in that election, did regional economic factors play into the surge supporting Donald Trump's campaign at all?
Well, so at the time, if you remember, if you look at, again, we're looking at the end of 2015, 2016, we're looking at, again, the reign of Democrats, and what I'm looking at, what we're all witnessing today is, again, the economy that is affecting these places in particular, these states and these districts in particular that we're talking about. I mean, you look at, the old blue collar steel mills, coal states. Those are all the areas where a lot of these immigrants, not just from Serbia, but other diasporas flock, because they were looking for a better life, and certainly those states did provide the better life for them throughout history. But particularly under the Democrat rule, even if you remember, under Obama, that economy started tanking. So it is very likely that this is again something that is in the hearts and minds of the American voters in general in those areas, but also in the hearts and minds of the American Serbs, because again, Serbs in the United States are not a separate entity. Very well integrated immigration has been here since the 1800s. The first immigrant Serb that came here was George Fisher, who actually established, or one of the first founders within Texas, and led the Texas Revolution, but he arrived initially to Pennsylvania. So you look at this trajectory of history, and yes, those people flocked to these states certainly because the economic factors that started really over the decades failing them, particularly that was visible under Obama. I mean, you'll remember even then, the gas prices started hiking up and things were really not going well. And candidate Trump was somebody who kept talking about policy. His opposition, including Hillary Clinton, kept talking about him as a person. But if you look at some of these immigrant communities, they are used to and they almost even seek strong leadership. And they recognize that somehow in President Trump, particularly in that economic development and in the economic segment, because that was one of his major talking points, particularly of these. And, sometimes you hear Americans, the coastal Americans, talk about the flyover states. Well, nobody who has such a long and deeply rooted history in this nation, in, let's say, Indiana and Pennsylvania and Midwest and even Ohio, Iowa, I mean, you have American Serbs and these other immigrant communities all across the country, not only in the coastal areas. They don't like to be treated as flyover segments of the population. Exactly. So they really paid attention to what his policy was. And the policy certainly revolved around strong economic factors. And I might add, not only here in the United States for us Americans, but strong economic policy around the world and cooperation in the economic segment, particularly in the Balkans. And that is actually how he wanted to address foreign policy as well via economy.
Now, what was behind you organizing Serbs for Trump 2020?
Well, so as you mentioned, I think with your help and your research that came out of 2016, and then we started really deeply looking at what the Serbian-American diaspora was doing politically, and whether it was doing enough or whether it was doing anything at all. I thought, with my own personal connections, given that you as you introduced me as a private security expert, I'm somebody who has worked within the segment of foreign policy, but also counterterrorism and transnational crimes, particularly during President Trump's administration. My work connected strongly to the Balkans. So I had already those developed relationships within President Trump's administration, and the way he was focusing on the Balkans and the way he was focusing on some of the frozen conflict issues that remain since the Yugoslav wars and since 1990s. He wanted to solve those issues via economy. As you remember, even my close relationship with Ambassador Richard Grenell, we kept talking about trying to bring some sort of solidity to the region, but they didn't want to deal in symbolism. They didn't want to deal in these deeply rooted problems that all American politicians and European Union, for that matter, failed to address for so many decades after the 1990s. They kept paying lip service to it, but nobody really had any solid solutions. President Trump, sending Ambassador Grenell as his envoy, came up with a very solid, at least, base to develop something new, which was, again, as you pointed out, developing the economic prospects of that region. So my relationships already that I had made me use the momentum to organize Serbs for Trump and put the American Serb diaspora on the map as a serious voting bloc that can actually impact elections, particularly in those swing states, in the important states. And you do mention Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, even Florida, but for example, even state like Arizona, huge Serbian community there. Certain states that you wouldn't even think of, for example, Alaska, Wyoming, those are all states in Nevada, states that have a deeply rooted Serb communities and history. We have 6 different Belgrades in the United States of America. One famous one is in Montana. And the reason why we have them is because those towns paid homage to the Serbian immigrants who were coming since the 1800s into this country and were developing not only trading routes, but were working in some of these communities as blue collars, but were also investors. They were building the rails. So there is a really important element that I wanted to use to, as I said, take that momentum and put the American Serbs onto the political map, because unfortunately, up until that point, the American Serbs were not politically active. They didn't quite understand what it meant to be a part of the political process in the country that they are paying taxes in, that they have been living in and raising their families for centuries now, that they have left such a deep impression on the American fabric. And I have to go back to that history so that our listeners understand the importance of the American fabric as an immigrant community, including American Serbs. As I mentioned, Texas and George Fisher, one of the leaders of the Texas Revolution, but then so many others. For example, Mihailo Pupin was one of the founders of NASA, what we know today as NASA. We have Nikola Tesla, who illuminated the world. He was one of the most famous Serbian-Americans. It was the Serbian flag that flew over the White House during World War I, because we were such close allies in both World War I and World War II. Going to World War II, Mission Halyard was when the Serbs, the Royalist Chetnik Army of Serbia, rescued 500 U.S. airmen. It was the greatest war rescue of all time. So the connection that the Serbs have to this land and to this nation is unprecedented, possibly unlike any other in this nation. I mean, to have a Serbian flag fly over the White House as the only nation around the world is incredible. And then you think of what Hillary Clinton has done and what Bill Clinton has done, and Madeleine Albright, who, by the way, grew up in Serbia, and she was protected by the Serbs when, as a little girl, she escaped the Nazi prosecution. Not many people know this, that Serbs rescued her and her father, clothed her, protected her. Her father was a diplomat in Serbia at the time. And this is how she repays the Serbian people, by calling them later on disgusting Serbs. I mean, some of these things are unprecedented. And for me at that time, being deeply ingrained in President Trump's administration within this transnational crimes work that I have to say he was brilliant on, and he truly paid attention to what our country needed at the time, I felt the need for the American Serbs to finally demonstrate who they are within this great nation of ours and what we can do together. Hence, Serbs for Trump became the official coalition partner to President Trump's re-election campaign.
Now, we've got to take a quick break, Olga, and I really want to ask a follow-up question when we get back. Do you think that the level of integration that the Serbs have in America, I know it's a very, very different than most diasporas, because most
Yes.
diasporas are, they don't integrate fully. They stay in their own enclaves, and they try to bring their home country into their enclave. And
Yes.
instead of, it's not a full, do you think that hurt the Serbians politically? We'll take that up right after the break, though, okay?
That is a great question, and yes, let's take a break and we'll deep dive into this.
This is George Eliason with TNT, and I'll see you after the break.
Free speech is in our DNA. Experimental vaccines will never change that. Listen to TNT Radio anywhere you go. Yeah, even there. Never miss out on the news and views of the big issues of the day. Ask Alexa or Google to play TNT Radio, or download the TNT Radio app for free from the App Store or Google Play. Today's News Talk. This is TNT Radio.
A lot of people may not agree with us right now, but there may come a time when they actually have an issue that affects them, that they don't have the freedom to choose. And if we don't preserve it, we won't have it.
Get to see this for yourself.
We begin this new week with an extraordinary moment in our history. 18 days into this truck convoy, and the federal government invoked a security measure that goes beyond anything seen in this country in the last 50 years.
Banks will be told to freeze the accounts of anyone helping finance the protests. And the owners of vehicles jamming streets will be directly targeted.
Trucking for Freedom, Chapter 1, How We Got Here. Visit truckingforfreedom.com.
When you need to know what's going on around the world and at home, keep it on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is George Eliason with TNT Radio. Welcome back. Now, before the break, I asked Dr. Ravasi that if the level of integration with the Serbian community actually hurt the political development.
And George, that is a great question, and one that I thought about simply because I spoke to someone recently who is an American Serb, but serves as a state representative in West Virginia and is one of those older generation Serbs. And I asked him point blank, particularly during the 1990s, why wasn't there more of an organization? And to their credit, to the credit of the American Serbs at the time, there were some attempts to organize and to counter the propaganda. But he kind of said to me, we simply didn't expect this. We didn't expect to be betrayed by the American political elite at the time and to be targeted in such a way, because we simply thought that all Americans knew everything about the Serbs because of the fact that we have been so well integrated and assimilated and contributed so much to this country. We simply thought everybody knew about this. So it actually took them by surprise, the level of propaganda and demonization that took place during the 1990s. So they couldn't even, find their bearings to even begin to counter this. And you understand how propaganda works. And I think we all witnessed it in the 1990s, and we keep witnessing it today. I mean, I was a young girl at the time. I was a teenager, but I watched it and I remember it, and I lived here through those times. It was devastating for the American Serb community. So potentially, yes, that is a great question, that our assimilation and integration didn't separate us to the point that I mentioned earlier. We don't feel like a separate entity. We're Americans, and many are Americans by choice. So we didn't think that we would be betrayed in such a way, given the history, given the alliance within World War I, World War II. Who would have thought But then again, when you look at the background of what was taking place, yes, the roles were already divided. Serbs bad, the other ones were good, and that's all you knew. And here we are today, 20, 30 years later. Those labels are very hard to shake. Nobody, even if there is media a story that sounds good about the Serbs, nobody really reads a whole lot of that because their minds have already been made up in the 1990s, and it's difficult to strip that etiquette.
I remember.
So to your point, yes, potentially that did hurt.
I remember reading a white paper about that particular time, and it was literally one day the Kosovo Liberation Army were on a terrorist list. They were terrorists.
Yes.
And the Serbs were the good guys. And literally the next day, and this is, the diplomat gave a speech saying that the Kosovo Liberation Army are terrorists, and then the next day, they're heroes of the Clinton administration, and the Serbs are the bad guys. And,
yes,
and that's
and this is how things change quickly. Somebody's terrorist is a liberation fighter the next day. I mean, it's fascinating, and that blueprint was actually sown in the Balkans with the KLA. But you at the time had all the Mujahedeens who were fighting on the side, not only were jumping into Kosovo war, but we must remember Bosnia. I mean, the Mujahedeens from all around Middle East were showing up to fight the Serbs in Bosnia. And that was the same story. But see, at the time, nobody wanted to touch this, and nobody wanted to counter Bill Clinton policy. And I remember at the time, even, for instance, somebody like Newt Gingrich, who is a great historian and understood this narrative and discourse and history very well. But the Republicans at the time still kind of decided to go after Bill Clinton on the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But all of the research, and as you said, even the white papers and things that were coming out of the Mujahedeens fighting on the side of the Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo at the time, nobody here in the United States wanted to touch that, and nobody wanted to address it as an issue that these fighters were flown on NATO planes into the region. And these are the same Mujahideen that actually participated afterwards in 9/11 and in every single terrorist attack around the world. There's always this connection to the Balkans. But see, nobody talks about that today. And this is what the Serbs experienced. All of a sudden, the terrorists were the good guys in the area. And I must say this, the first chopped head after the Ottoman Empire left the region was again a Christian Serb head in the hands of these Islamic radicals that were operating in the Balkans. But see, again, these are not the pictures that CNN was painting at the time. The picture that CNN was painting at the time was all of a sudden Serbs bad, Serbs little Russians, Serbs are butchers, Serbs are rapists. And these are the things that were coming out of the mouth of even now President Biden. You will remember how adamant he was about the bombing. John McCain, I mean, you had a variety of characters who are back in power even today. And as I said, there has never been a war that they disliked. And that includes Hillary Clinton and the Clintons and, the Bushes and the Bidens. And if we look at these American dynasties, political dynasties, I mean, obviously, this is how all of them built their political legacies and built a lot of wealth meanwhile. So again, when you look at all of this, President Trump was a completely different voice. He was a breath of fresh air, and the Serbs understood how to differentiate the personality of the man and the policies he was talking about. And the majority of the Serbian-Americans, not all, as I said, not monolith, but majority of Serbian-Americans went in this direction. And I'm glad we made such an impact in the election process.
Now, if we go from the 2016 election to the 2020, after the 2020 election, well, actually from 16 to 2020, that whole period, it was a constant trials for the Trump administration. What was your community's reaction to the Russiagate, Russian interference narratives plaguing the Trump administration all throughout the period?
Well, so there are several aspects of this that I'd like to address. And again, as somebody who has worked for a long time within the foreign policy arena and counterterrorism and transnational crimes, and looking at what takes place in different countries at different times and how that potentially replicates here to the United States, or rather how the United States, our elite, sets up certain policy, puts it out into the world, replicates it there, but then somehow all of that makes it back and the chickens come home to roost. I look at what happened in the Balkans, and literally as of 2016, as I spoke to many different prominent figures, we immediately had a coup d'etat against a duly elected president here in the United States.
Right.
An unprecedented amount of, again, something that is very familiar to the American Serbs, propaganda and demonization, and this entire Russiagate and the fake dossier that now we found out was completely funded by Hillary Clinton, and the alleged Russian interference. You know, for the Serbs, this hits home simply because, and completely unjustly, Serbs tend to be viewed as little Russians because people don't understand history. We are not great learners of history. Serbs are not little Russians. And in fact, even if you look at that socialist communist period of Yugoslavia, the way Tito became famous was that he said no, the famous no to Stalin in 1948. So there was certainly that separation of the Serbs, although Serbs were very anti-communist and anti-socialist, which is what made them flock to the United States. But being viewed through that Russian prism is very disheartening for the Serbs, because Serbs are a freedom-loving people who have throughout history demonstrated their strength and demonstrated their independence and demonstrated the defense of almost the world, and particularly defense of Europe against different invasions, which included the Ottomans, which included the Austro-Hungarians, which included the Germans, and which essentially included the Soviet communists. Because, see, Serbs, and at the time Yugoslavia, did not grow up behind the Iron Curtain. So we really don't have that connection. We were more Westernized than anything. I mean, God, we grew up with Disney and rock and roll and Levi's and Coca-Cola. So to us, being viewed through that prism simply because of Christian Orthodox traditions, yes, there is a traditional friendship with the Russian Empire, but that is quite different from Soviet Union. And that is actually one portion of history that as Americans, we tend to forget, that communist part of Soviets, let's say, is just but a speck of time within lengthy history of Russia and Russian Empire. So as Americans, we have much more in common, let's say, with the Russian people than not. However, again, back to your question, President Trump did not consolidate his power. And that was very difficult to do within that first 4 years, within his first term. I have to say that as great as he was in certain segments, I think the criticism that I hear overall is that he tends to have bad advisors. He does not pick the best people to be around him. And sometimes that is even visible today in terms of who he is endorsing. There's some backlash within his voter base that includes some Serbs, of course, as far as picking the most friendly and the most loyal people to him. Because now, in retrospect, when you look at all of the advisors that he had, I mean, it's almost like he had people who were ready to betray him sitting in his own kitchen.
Right.
So that is one thing that's been very difficult to comprehend. And then again, you look at the media attacks, the Russia gate, the Russians were like literally jumping out of refrigerators and were under the beds. Russians were everywhere. And of course, the media plays a huge part in this because they are political activists. They are not journalists, and they are just regurgitating talking points from the Democrat talking points, particularly. And, you know, you even have some neocons who were doing the same thing and consistently talking about Russia, Russia, Russia. When in fact, now we see that all of this was in fact a big scam. But unfortunately, our agencies were weaponized not only against the duly elected president, but our agencies were weaponized against the American people. And what happened around the world in terms of the blueprint of regime change and colored revolutions and coup d'etat that both you and I are very familiar with, that is exactly what was replicated here in the United States against President Trump, against American people. And I keep talking about this, and I know I almost bring it up in every interview, but it's simply because it resonates so strongly with me. Darren Beatty, the journalist who now runs Revolver News, who was close to President Trump's administration, on January 10th, after January 6th and all of the fiascos that have taken place, on January 10th, he tweets out something fascinating, which is 70 plus million Americans today are the Serbs of the 1990s. And I think that speaks volumes, because for everyone who understands the history of what happened to the Serbs, what's happening in the United States, what happened in 2020, and what's happening today is the exact same thing. The conservative Americans, the political dissent is being demonized and targets are being placed on their backs. And that also happened, of course, to President Trump.
That's actually a very succinct way of putting it. We've got to take another break right now, and we'll pick it up after the break, okay?
Thanks.
This is George Eliason with TNT, and we'll be right back.
The midterms, and America votes on November 8th. With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Jeremy Beck.
In this midterm election season, the establishment legacy media is very focused on what they call the big lie. To them, the big lie is not that COVID vaccines are safe and effective, or that NATO is fighting to save democracy in Ukraine. Oh no, the big lie to them is that Trump actually won the 2020 presidential election. For elections that have been called so far this primary season, 105 candidates who outright dispute the result of the 2020 election and 42 candidates who have questioned the results have won the Republican nomination out of 284 nominees in total. This means that 52% of the GOP nominees so far endorsed the so-called big lie in some way. But maybe it's the other way around, and there is evidence of widespread electoral fraud. I'll let you be the judge. I'm Jeremy Beck for TNT Radio.
When it comes to vaping, the truth can get clouded. So let's make it clear. Vaping is not safe for youth.
Because vaping can put microscopic particles into your lungs.
And dangerous things like metals into your body.
And nicotine, which can harm a person's brain development through their mid-20s.
With appealing flavors, high nicotine levels, and lots of promotion on social media.
Many kids think vaping is harmless, but it's not.
So talk to your kids about the risks of vaping.
Because when you talk, they hear you.
Learn more at underagedrinking.samhsa.gov.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
Several world leaders and notable multinational corporations now actively promote an energy transformation to so-called clean green hydrogen. Mainstream media will not expose the facts on the hydrogen fuel alternative. Hydrogen is an energy carrier, not an energy source. It requires enormous energy from another source to create it, and this storage of energy in hydrogen is very expensive. It can be compressed or stored chemically at a higher density, such as in metal hydrides. But this is all resource intensive. If you want higher energy bills, hydrogen will help. If you want higher costs of living, hydrogen will help. And burning hydrogen in air is not so environmentally friendly. It may produce emissions with up to 6 times higher levels of toxic nitrogen oxides compared with burning natural gas.
Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of choice, freedom of assembly, freedom of health. The voice of freedom is TNT Radio.
This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm your host, George Eliason, and we have Dr. Olga Ravasi, an international security expert and the founder of Serbs for Trump 2020. Welcome back.
Thank you, George.
Dr. Ravasi, I'd like to jump into 2020 during, we're starting in the spring. Things are starting to wind up a little bit. And then beginning in June, we've got the BLM ANTIFA violence going on. Mm-hmm. Did your communities feel the violence was a pre-election tool to intimidate them from casting their vote?
I think so. And what we saw that summer of 2020, again, is unprecedented for most Americans. But for the American Serb community, it wasn't a complete surprise because, again, going back to 2000 in particular, in Serbia, I remember waking up in Chicago. I lived in Chicago at the time, waking up and seeing all across CNN and all across all of our mainstream media outlets, Belgrade's parliament that is being stormed by protesters and is burning, and fights with the police. So to us, this was not a surprise. But what we understood is that the mechanisms and the tools that were used for the type of colored revolution and regime change that was enacted elsewhere was very much so what we were seeing from BLM and ANTIFA, to the point of recognizing the symbols of a clenched fist. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, if you look around the world, every single as they call it, peaceful revolution had a specific symbol, and that always includes a clenched fist. And that type of symbolism directly comes from the Balkans and from an organization at the time called Otpor, meaning resistance, that later on changed their name into Canvas. And that organization was led by then student Serb Srđa Popović, who in fact became this revolutionary, the international revolutionary. And I have to say, as an American Serb or Serbian-American, if you wish, this is probably one of the worst exports that we have into the international arena, because with so many wonderful things that Serbs have contributed to not just the United States, but to the world, this is not the one that we should be proud of. But nevertheless, when you look at Black Lives Matter and ANTIFA and the ways they have been trained and organized to enact this quote unquote peaceful revolution, but there's a lot of violence. You remember CNN saying mostly a little fiery, but mostly peaceful or something like that.
Right.
Well, that's precisely what their playbook is. And the playbook was Gene Sharp's book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. I mean, this is how this entire movement came about. So literally what we were seeing through Maidan, for example, in Ukraine, what we were seeing in Arab Spring, what we saw in Egypt, what we saw in Serbia, what we're seeing around the world replicated itself and manifested itself finally into Black Lives Matter and ANTIFA. And they have the same symbols, they use the same tactics, and you can tell that it is the same hand that in fact is directing this type of violence. And we're seeing it just as you mentioned in your introduction. Roe Wade was overturned last night, and I'm sure everybody has been following the Antifa kind of infiltrating this quote unquote feminist women's movement that is out on the streets right now. And they're pretty much doing the same thing. So the burning of our cities in 2020 may as well happen this summer. And don't you find the timing fascinating? Because again, we are headed into an election in November, but here we are again. We're bracing for burning cities. So yes, certainly the communities felt targeted, they felt intimidated, but not completely surprised, because we have witnessed this before. And because of our history, we were able to pinpoint what it is, and we were able to recognize it for what it is. And it's simply, I must call it, a regime change tool and a colored revolution that is now aimed against the American people. And anytime actually now that we have something that is going to be highly disputed, you may expect this type of violence in our big cities like Chicago, like Washington, D.C., like New York, like LA. Big cities have actually become a cesspool of violence, and of particularly political violence. And it seems like this is the extended hand of the Democrat Party. And I just have to mention something else, and you will remember the organization or the movement at the time, Occupy Wall Street. As much as even some of these movements are spontaneous and organic, I assure you, having studied this for a very long time, they become infiltrated by the same hands. And I can tell you that members of Otpor and Canvas, as we call it today, and Srđan Popović himself have been involved with Occupy Wall Street and have certainly been involved with BLM and ANTIFA.
Oh, that's saying quite a lot, actually. Wow.
That is saying quite a lot.
That is. At BLM in 2020, they took credit for Joe Biden's victories in the swing states and the general election. What kind of messaging was BLM and ANTIFA bringing to your communities during the election?
Well, honestly, if messaging is something that we can define them by, messaging is violence, and messaging is harassment, and messaging is targeting political opposition. And unlike their mouthfuls of tolerance, it is precisely what they're demonstrating: intolerance and almost fascist tactics. It's ludicrous to even march under the banners of anti-fascism, which is what they like to call themselves, in the name of tolerance and democracy, when these people are highly intolerant. And they don't know what democracy means if it hit them on their head. And on top of it, we are a constitutional republic. But that put aside, the messaging that they're bringing is violence. And obviously, it is a political tool of intimidation. And it is something that, as I said, is becoming widespread in our big cities. And we are witnessing it even tonight or this morning and overnight with the women who have been out there marching. The messaging of Antifa has been massive violence. And I am afraid that we have to brace for yet another summer of violence. That is the only message that I can pick out of everything that they have stood for. And again, let's be honest, there is maybe something to be said about certain communities that have gone through some hardships throughout the history of the United States. And Black communities certainly have rights to unsatisfaction to a certain degree. However, when we start segmenting groups of people, and even to your point, did this hurt Serbian-Americans politically being so assimilated into the Americanness. Well, the Black communities have been assimilated, and the Latino communities, and all of us, again, as Americans, have to understand that this society and this nation is not perfect. It is an imperfect nation, but I will ask you one thing in light of BLM and in light of Antifa. Show me a country where minorities and immigrants have achieved a grander level of success individually and as communities than in the United States. Show me a country. Because again, there is a reason why communities from around the world are flocking to these shores even today. You know that we have a disaster on our southern border. Are all of these people, are you telling me that these people are trying to literally die on their way to get into the United States so that they can be oppressed? This is not making any sense. So yes, while I understand that certain communities, including the Black American community, has a bone to pick with the political establishment, but that is the bone that we all have to pick with the political establishment that has turned itself into an elitist establishment that doesn't care about the American people. But that applies across a board. It's not just the Black community or Latino community or American Serb community. But as I said, you know, immigrants have flocked to these shores for a reason. Immigrants have come here to dream that American dream, whether the dream is still alive or not, that's up for debate. But yet what BLM is doing is a huge disservice to their own communities, because they are not taking into consideration the violence that is happening within their own communities. Again, that they are the victims of this. Just last night, there was a shooting again in Chicago where a 5-month-old baby was shot. I mean, every weekend you look at Baltimore, you look at Chicago, you look at New York, you look at all of these big cities with huge numbers and statistics of Black on Black violence. So BLM essentially does not represent the core of what the Black community is struggling with. They are not addressing the gun violence. They are not addressing the fatherless homes. They are not addressing the huge amounts of opiates that are on the streets, not just in Black communities, but also in very poor white communities. So, I mean, this is a fight we have to fight as Americans.
Can I yes. for a second?
Absolutely.
We're going to go to a break, the top of the hour. Can I hold you over into the next hour for a few questions too?
Absolutely not a problem. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This is George Eliason with TNT Talk Radio, and we'll see you after the break.
You're listening to George Eliason, live from Donbass, Ukraine, on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is George Eliason with TNT Radio. I'm here with Dr. Olga Ravasi, and she's a light in terms of the political landscape today, to be honest with you. Now, Dr. Ravasi, you said there was some intimidation during the last election by BLM and ANTIFA. Now, was there any community-wide targeted harassment based on the 2016 wards that voted for Donald Trump?
Nothing that I can point community-wide, although some of the members of our organization who were somewhat prominent in terms of political organizing and community organizing did receive some anonymous letters that were threatening because, even after 2020, some of our members actually still have flags and banners in front of their homes that had Trump Pence 2020 signs and American flags, of course, very patriotic symbols out there in front of their homes. So I think within their own neighborhoods, they were threatened and some letters were sent to them anonymously. And of course, those were filtered over to me, but nothing that directly targeted the community within the wards. Although what was interesting is that within this whole Antifa unrest, the Serbs were more attacked by their own, I would say, opposition communities. So not necessarily Americans, but like the Bosnian community and the Albanian communities who were more in Biden's camp. And they truly disliked the fact that the Serbs were very prominent political bloc and a prominent bloc overall within President Trump's campaign. So it's kind of interesting that some of those old ghosts, I would say, from the Balkans were more threatening within those ranks of Antifa, because of course, they have them everywhere. So those were, I would call them some minor intimidation tactics. But again, as I said, Serbs throughout history have gone through so much that none of this surprises them and none of it phases them a whole lot. So even if you remember what was happening in Kenosha, even with the shooting and the guy Kyle Rittenhouse who was defending himself, Kenosha is a very strong community for American Serbs. We in fact have a church there in Wisconsin. So that was pretty scary for the community when Kenosha was burning down and all of the BLM violence in the aftermath of George Floyd. So obviously, as I said, the community is not segmented. It is assimilated and lives, of course, not in their own little ghettos. We're American just as anybody else. So whatever is threatening to Americans is threatening to American Serbs. So that is the same level of intimidation that we feel.
And now, do you think BLM and ANTIFA were trying to create a skewed vote in these towns that were burning based on
I certainly do believe so. And actually, yes, I do believe so. And in fact, if you remember, on the day of voting, there were groups, organized groups around polling places. Even the members of the Black Panthers were around. So, I mean, certainly there were levels of intimidation that our communities have witnessed all across. It happened in Georgia also, not only limited to the states that we're talking about, but it happens all across the nation. And Serbs, because we live in all of these different states and we're covering such a wide area of the United States and mostly the big cities. This is where the immigration has gone to. If you look at Chicago, for example, and Chicagoland, that borders Indiana and Wisconsin, you have about 350,000 Serbs just in Chicagoland area. Now, again, very, very blue Cook County, blue Chicago, Democratic Chicago or Democrat Chicago. And then you have these Republican voters. So, I mean, you can imagine, how they feel when they witness this and when they see some of these, let's say, threatening faces that are masked up and in black clothing, calling themselves Antifa or BLM or whatever it is that they call themselves. It's unnerving, but at the same time, I think what all Americans, including the Serbs, understand that we are at a precipice and we should not allow ourselves to be intimidated and to be politically intimidated, because again, this is the reason why this nation has had open doors for immigrants, because of that one holy cow almost, which is your right to vote. You know, if you look at other nations around the world, not everybody was always able to vote. And that is one thing that I think everybody demonstrated, particularly in 2016, because the political elite, and in 2020, but in 2016 in particular, the political elite has disenfranchised the American people to such a degree, especially the white Americans. It's labeled them bigoted, it's labeled them racist, it's labeled them all kinds of horrendous things, that the only thing they had left, they stripped them away from their livelihood, they took away their jobs, they're literally eliminating the middle class, and the only tool that they had left to fight was their vote. And that is what they demonstrated with voting for President Donald Trump in 2016. And ultimately, I do believe that they overwhelmingly voted for him in 2020. But again, the jury is still out on that one.
Now, did you or your organizers witness anything tying BLM or ANTIFA to definite DNC election support missions? You know, we're looking at street level violence, but.
Well, I mean, you know, it's very difficult to pinpoint those connections in terms of hard evidence. And again, I am not a prosecutor, and I am not somebody who has been collecting this type of evidence. Unfortunately, for all of us, we should have possibly paid more attention at the time when President Trump was even saying, they are going to do this, they are going to do this. I think in all of our minds, we thought that there was some sort of a contingency plan. And I think all of us now are shocked that there wasn't. So tying Antifa and BLM directly to the DNC election machinery is difficult in terms of hard evidence, but I think circumstantial evidence speaks volumes. I mean, this is what we're witnessing consistently. And this is what we witnessed throughout 2020. I mean, they were certainly not out burning our cities in the name of the Republican Party or the conservative movement or President Trump. They were obviously rooting for Joe Biden and for Democrat politicians. And on top of it, I think the major piece of evidence of this collusion would be the fact that all of the politicians, including now Vice President Kamala Harris, were fundraising to get these people out of jails. So, I mean, what more do we need? I think that speaks volumes to all of us. But again, how do you, especially now, when the Democrats control all the pillars of power and all of the justice system, even when it comes to the election fraud, or as they say, alleged election fraud, and saying there's no evidence. Well, is there evidence to the collusion between Black Lives Matter and Antifa and the DNC? Even if there is, and I think there is, and we have witnessed it ourselves quite in the open with the Democrat politicians fundraising and taking these people out of jails. But saying there is no evidence is very different from saying we don't want to see the evidence. And I think the latter is the case. Nobody wants to see the evidence of the election fraud or of Antifa and the DNC having a collusion. And in fact, I will be at liberty to say that certainly they are a tool of the Democrat Party, and they are funded by Soros and by the web of his NGOs. And what's interesting is Antifa is not only operating in the United States. I think both you and I know that they have gathered all around the world, and they have had demonstrations in UK, and you actually have Antifa in Ukraine, and you have Antifa everywhere. And I will point to something that is fascinating to me, and I think our American people don't know this and don't understand it. The web, and to me, that is the major piece of evidence of Antifa and BLM being connected not only to the DNC, but to those who are holding the DNC in power and funding the DNC, including George Soros and his Open Society Fund that operates within the webs of NGOs around the world, under being funded through USAID and through NED. You had, they called them, for example, in Serbia, women in black, who literally were standing out in the city center of Belgrade, holding signs, George Floyd, I can't breathe. Now, please explain to me, what does Belgrade, Serbia have to do with George Floyd and I can't breathe? Why do you have members of Antifa, or these women in black, as they call them over there, holding George Floyd signs in the midst of Belgrade? And I'm sure they were in Ukraine, and I'm sure they were in Georgia, and I'm sure they were elsewhere. What does that have anything to do with what is taking place in the United States? And you know what else? Last night, ever since the overturning of Roe Wade, you are having the same types of women out in the streets. For now, we see them on social media, who are now trying to defend women's rights, again, in Belgrade, Serbia, or in Ukraine, or in Georgia. So that is more than enough evidence for me to say that the DNC and Antifa and the funding mechanism behind it operates internationally. So then you could very well look at Antifa as an international organization.
Right. Correct. I think the most interesting one, because you brought it up, it was in ISIS-controlled Syria. They painted a little mural. They're holding up signs, George Floyd, I can't breathe. And this is ISIS-controlled area with an ISIS supporter.
How fascinating. It blows my mind, honestly, George. Crazy.
Yeah, that just, it is crazy until you realize that the Syrian diaspora in America supports them. They were actually trying to set up a diaspora member in a post-Assad government, or if they break the country, in that government over ISIS in an Islamic State situation. That makes it even more crazy.
That is incredible, but that again tells you the difference between the Democrat Party and the international machinery, the international globalist machinery that has replicated itself around the world, versus the conservatives. And that is actually the difference in ideology. Conservatives are meant to conserve, right? And meant to keep whatever it is that they have within their own nation. Conservatives don't replicate their values outside of their own area where they operate, essentially. And you can say that these are national conservatives in every single nation, but they don't look at the world as a globalist playground for themselves to impose their own set of values on the rest of the world. Unlike the globalists. Exactly. And of course, there's something to be said about the rhinos and you know, the neocons that are doing this via tools of war. But I'm speaking strictly in terms of liberalism and conservatism. Well, the liberals are certainly looking on the international stage to replicate their own set of values, where I had a conversation, fascinating one yesterday, with another journalist. And he said, as conservatives, we have actually decided that the best position is to be neutral. And to be fair, we ought to be neutral. So no matter what they do, we need to stay neutral. And he argues that this is the biggest mistake, not only that we're conserving, but our neutrality is actually not conserving anything. And in fact, the liberal world order has taken over to the point that you just made, that in ISIS-controlled territories in Syria, you've got Antifa holding signs, George Floyd, I can't breathe. I mean, that is just fascinating stuff. But that actually tells our audience and the American people, but all of the world, in fact, where we are. And when you look at the Davos crowd and you look at this globalist machinery of the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and how they operate and what the pillars of power are that they're holding, they certainly have their agents in every single country in this world, and they can they can literally, with one press of a button, activate those agents to act on their behalf anywhere in the world and do what they're doing. And certainly that was the case in Serbia, even finding out within the election. And I don't know if we need to delve too deep into this, because I think, again, as I said, jury is still out on this one and we haven't heard much. But we found out post-election that Dominion had an office in Serbia as well. So, I mean, the globalists have taken the agents that they use and put them all around the world to hide them from our American laws. And they're able to do this via the power that they hold. And of course, via massive, massive funding.
Now, we've got to go to a break real quick. Okay, I want to pick this up again after the break. This is George Eliason with TNT Radio, and we'll see you right after the break.
Shannon Joy on TNT Radio.
This is why they fear her so much. Brooke Jackson, I know it was a long introduction, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork because I am so impressed by you and everything you do. Welcome to the Shannon Joy Show.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about the FDA. You mentioned that you were listening to this circus sideshow. It's really just a matter of crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and going through the motions, right? They want this shot into the arms of the babies. I will give you some good news, though. In New York State, recently, as recent as 4 to 6 weeks ago, they're saying this in the polling, how few parents have actually gone out and had their kids vaccinated. They make us think that everyone's doing it, but I think the reality is that more and more parents are very quietly refusing.
It does make me feel better, yes. I actually just read a poll recently that 73% of Americans have reservations about these shots.
Shannon Joy on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702 or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Government has taken our rights and will never give them back unless we make them. The voice of freedom is TNT Radio.
This is TNT Talk Radio, and we're back with Dr. Olga Ravasi. Now let's go post-election 2020. It happened. Biden was declared. And a lot of ink was spilled about this, about election fraud, particularly in the cities, the swing states where the Serbs for Trump 2020 had strong organizations. Now, in the wards and precincts where the Serbian-American communities live, and especially Wisconsin and Michigan, Was voter interference limited to the intimidation and violence on the street, or did the communities notice a skewing of election results that doesn't fit their community's voting profile and history?
I honestly think it was the latter because, as I said, we have gotten our bearings. Well, first of all, the night of the election, I think everybody realized that something was wrong. I think as the voters were heading to the polls, there was a lot of excitement, honestly, around it. I mean, of course, we came out of that summer of violence and intimidation around the communities, but the Serbian-American community in particular was very excited because of everything that has gone on throughout the campaign. So there was a level of confidence that I've never seen before, that I've never witnessed before in the communities, in terms of understanding that there were many more voters that they've registered even compared to 2016, even in terms of understanding that there were voters here who were American Serbs who've lived in this country for 30 years and have never before registered to vote, and they went out and voted in 2020. So, I mean, I think there was such a excitement about the entire campaign and the profiling of the Serbian-Americans as a voting bloc, along with all the other Blacks for Trump, Latinos for Trump, women for Trump. I mean, this entire diversity coalition was so proactive, and it registered an unprecedented amount of voters that never voted before. So heading into the polls was almost something that they were taking pride in that day. And then all of a sudden, at about 1 or 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, everybody started recognizing that something was wrong, because we did have some of our people out as poll watchers, and all of a sudden they were shushed out. They were told to go home, that it was done, and then we were glued to the television sets, you know, just looking at these counts, and they started not making sense, because all of a sudden you saw these fluctuations. And then obviously knowing the profile of the community, knowing the history, knowing what was happening in 2016 and how we magnified that for 2020, it certainly, we kind of were almost hit with the bucket of cold water, and we realized that something was wrong and that things were not going the way we anticipated and the way, unfortunately, everybody anticipated. So those were the elements of irregularities. I guess it didn't match to what the community was doing in terms of the campaign, the voters registered. And if you remember, one big thing that we had within the community at the time, and this was happening in parallel to the election, it was the US Census. And why I want to focus on the census, and we still have actually to find out the precise numbers, and unfortunately I'm not too optimistic. However, if you look at the profile and history of the American Serb community and all other communities, immigrant communities, since, let's say, the 1800s to today, when you look at the census figures, they do not give you the precise, correct numbers of specific ethnicities of immigrant communities. And that is partially, I'd say, particularly within the Serb community. I'm sure that it's similar for the Greeks and for Armenians and for all others. We don't have precise numbers. Now, the church would be probably the closest in terms of having their own constituents registered. So the church has more of numbers and figures how many people we have here. But if you look at the history from the 1800s on, we toy with the figure of about 1.2 million American Serbs. But as I said, they were arriving in different immigration waves throughout history. So the question was, well, who do you consider an American Serb? Who do you consider a Serb? And who do you consider a Serbian-American? I think those are very different segments depending on when they came here or whether they were born here or not. And do they even, because Up until now, you couldn't say that you were a Serb on a census figure. So this 2020 census ran in parallel to the election. So we were actually trying to get the people to put down that they were of Serbian ethnicity or Greek ethnicity. So we're still waiting to see what those numbers are going to be. But based on the last census figures, it says that there are 170,000 Serbs in the United States. That's actually not accurate at all. So I think with the election results, yes, exactly. With the election results and how the communities voted in 2020, and then we were very adamant about filling out that census, I think there's something to be said about those figures and how we compare the two. And I think that will tell you, to your question, the skewing of the election results, because they really do not make sense.
So you did notice election night irregularities. Did you notice them in other states that your organization
Arizona was a big one. And Arizona was a big one, and Arizona remains a big one even to today, particularly that Maricopa County. Wisconsin is a big one, which is the Waukesha County, Pennsylvania. Michigan was a little more quiet, and I think even the aftermath when you look at their governor, and this is why it's actually very important to pick good governors. I mean, you know what was happening with Governor Gretchen Whitmer over there, and with the whole fake FBI plot that was geared allegedly to her assassination. I mean, it's just insane what's been happening. So Michigan Serbs were a little more quiet when it came to verbalizing what they witnessed, but certainly Arizona and Wisconsin remain big ones. And there's still cases out there that are being pushed through the justice system, but obviously we're all witnesses to that, and nothing is coming out of it.
Well, has anybody investigating this spoken to you directly?
No, I actually received word immediately post-election on some of the Dominion figures and on some of the interference. I had a huge white paper delivered to me on this topic and on IP addresses and where the pings were picked up, things like that. Right. And I did reach out to somebody. I wouldn't like to name names at this point. I did reach out to somebody that I had a close working relationship with during the campaign to talk about what I found, and I was told we're on it. We got the info. They looked at some of the graphs that I had, and I did deliver that to people that I trusted at least, but since then I haven't heard anything. And we just, unfortunately moved into this whole 2022 and 2024, but I think you're asking great questions, because I am a deep believer of completely unpacking 2020, because I don't think we can move forward unless we know what truly took place in 2020. I mean, how do you, and this is not to say to our voters and to our fellow Americans that we don't need to go out and vote. We actually need to go out and vote en masse in order to, even if there is some election skewing, the massive number of voters help that situation, in fact, because they can't work so hard. They simply cannot steal that much. So, I mean, we need to encourage people to go out and vote, particularly now in November. However, I mean, I think there's still so many questions left over from 2020. And I hate to say it, but people have lost faith in the electoral process. If you remember, I said one holy thing that was left over to the people who have been so demonized and disenfranchised was their vote. And now you took that away from them. Well, what's left? They feel completely helpless. So until we clarify 2020, it's going to be very difficult. But again, the powers that be don't want to touch this with the 10-foot pole, and they actually don't want to even talk about the possible influence that happened internationally in our voting. But I can tell you, it doesn't seem it was in Russia. It seems like it was in other countries, including Germany, including Venezuela, including Italy. But again, the jury is out, and nobody wants to deal with it.
Now, what I think, it's a shame that they didn't talk to you up front, but that still may come about because you have what you have is a perfect case to measure everything else up against. A test case, not.
Yes, I think we certainly do have measurable tools there that could be used.
Exactly. And, you can use that to, set a basis of whether or not there was interference in other places too. So it still may come about because you know what your communities are, where they are, how they're voting. You saw your people that were monitoring the election kicked out, and then you saw massive discrepancies directly afterwards.
Yes.
So
agreed, 100%.
This is, this is for the Democrats the case from hell.
Yes, it
is. This is looked at and pushed forward.
Well, and I'll tell you,
sure.
Yes, but to your point that this is a case from hell for the Democrats, I feel that, and it's something that we're witnessing, that the Democrats are also losing control of their voters base. And coupled with people who have, for example, just recently watched the film by Dinesh D'Souza, 2000 Mules, all of a sudden, when you look at the statistics of independents and Democrats who were exposed to some of these facts, you see their minds changing. So, people are not really, unless some of those who are completely deeply invested in their own cause, and no matter how much evidence you present, they will not change their mind. But ultimately, there are many rational people out there. I hate to believe that as a country, we are so polarized that we can't open our eyes to a straight set of evidence. And that we lost so much faith in government, which we have, that we don't believe anything anymore. Well, that's a bad scenario for both Democrats and Republicans.
Exactly.
There's certainly a civil war going on within the GOP. Because you have some Republicans who are still kind of sticking with their little Democrat friends and voting. The Second Amendment and the gun control, the first serious gun control legislation that was put through, you have 14 kind of, as they call them, rhino Republicans voting with Democrats. The Trump conservative voter base is really angry with them. But let's not fool ourselves. As much as we think that the Democrats are monolith and homogenous, their base is very angry with them as well, because they're paying those $5, $6, $8 at the pump. There's no food in the stores. They're angry with President Biden. So coupled with what we could possibly uncover about 2020, I still want to believe that there are still very much rational old Democrats out there who understand that our government has abandoned us completely, and that this could be something that we can change together. And certainly exactly. 2020 would be that case.
Exactly. Now, in terms of the new laws on guns that they just passed, the thing that sticks out is this. They're doing it for the school shooting, but it was the only reason it stopped and it wasn't any worse is because a citizen with a gun went inside and stopped it.
Yes.
So, yes.
And the precedent for it was the Buffalo shooting, right? But the Buffalo shooting would not prevent what took place by these gun laws, because that's exactly what kind of laws they have. So, case in point, it wouldn't have prevented it. It didn't prevent it. But yet we take this, and what's become fascinating is that the extreme sides of every issue are the basis for creating policy. And that is actually what is polarizing the nation. Not just about the gun laws, because again, as I mentioned, if you look at Portland, if you look at Chicago, for heaven's sakes, that has strictest gun laws almost in the country, you got shootings every night. So obviously, this is not working. You have this entire narrative now around abortion because of overturning Roe Wade. Well, there were pundits who came out and started comparing what went on with the Second Amendment and the SCOTUS ruling, and now what's going on with Roe Wade and the SCOTUS ruling. But what is the big glaring difference between the two? Constitution. Open up the Constitution. Is the Second Amendment a constitutional right? Yes, it is. Is the abortion ever mentioned in the Constitution? No, it's not. And that should end all the debate. And this is not to say that somebody is pro-choice or pro-life. This is to say that we need to follow the law of the land. We need to follow the Constitution. And as somebody who was teaching American government as a college professor, and the Constitution and comparative government, this is what the 10th Amendment is all about. It's about the states' rights. And when you look at the states' rights, and for example, you look at a state like Florida, well, we have our wonderful Governor DeSantis, who has actually segmented Florida from the rest of the country in terms of craziness that went on with the lockdowns, with Antifa, with burning down the cities, with all of this nonsense that the rest of the country is seeing. We haven't seen any of it here in Florida, and that is thanks to our government, and that is thanks to that beautiful thing that's called separation of state and federal government.
Okay, we've got to go to another break, and I've got a few more questions for you right afterwards, okay?
Sure.
This is George Eliason with TNT, and I'll see you after the break.
The midterms and America votes on November 8th. With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Jeremy Beck.
The upcoming Republican primary for Illinois' 15th congressional district will be held on the 28th of June. It will be a key contest to watch, with incumbent Representative Mary Miller, endorsed by former President Donald Trump, and Rodney Davis, a member of the US House, currently representing Illinois' 13th congressional district. On her campaign website, Miller proudly states she is the only member of Congress from Illinois to oppose every aspect of the Biden-Pelosi agenda, including the disgraceful January 6 Witch Hunt Commission, President Biden's red flag gun confiscation measures, COVID vaccine mandates and databases, and taxpayer-funded chemical abortion. Legacy media describes challenger Rodney Davis as being more moderate, and he even introduced the bill to support the inquiry into the so-called January 6 insurrection. But GOP voters in Illinois may decide Trump-endorsed Miller is the preferred candidate. I'm Jeremy Beck for TNT Radio.
Are you finding it harder to do the things you used to do? Like vacuuming or getting to appointments? If you need a bit of support at home, the Australian Government's My Aged Care is your starting point to access services. You'll find all the information and advice you need in the one place. To find out about other services, eligibility and costs, call 1-800 200 422 or go to myagedcare.gov.au. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra, spoken by Heather Christie.
The PCR test for monkeypox. Another crap PCR test for another crap virus. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
This is TNT Talk Radio. I'm your host, George Eliason, and I've got the fabulous Dr. Olga Ravasi with me today. Dr. Ravasi, would you like to add anything about the voter election irregularities in those states before we move on?
Well, I think we've covered a lot. As I said, what I would like to do, and you know, every time I talk to you, you give me ideas and things pop up in my mind because your research spurred some of this 2016 districting and tracing the votes and how the community operated. But now that we had this conversation, and you know, if we could map out whatever comes out of these census figures, because again, you know, the fault maybe partially may fall on the Serbian community for really not knowing the precise numbers of its community around the country. But I can tell you it's certainly closer to 1 million figure or 1.2 million figure rather than 170,000. Comparing that to the election results in these districts, I think it would be a fascinating research.
When do you think you'll have those results?
I am still not sure. I mean, we keep waiting. Things still have not clarified on that. So I'll get back to you on that one. Some elements of the census came out, but I don't think we still have the clear picture.
Okay, now let's look at today, 2022. We're heading into the midterm elections in November. Yep. Does the Serbian community support Joe Biden's agenda for America in any way?
I don't think any community. Yes, I don't think any community supports Joe Biden's agenda. I don't think Joe Biden supports Joe Biden's agenda. You know, it's very difficult to. They used to say that President Biden would be the moderate who will unite the country. That was the talking point. Well, he's not coming across as a moderate. He's not coming across as a unifier. And he's certainly not coming across as somebody who knows what is really happening around the country or around the world. So I think the first major question we all have on our mind is who is running the country. I think that's important to find out. And secondly, whatever the agenda is, as they said, the adults are now in the room. Well, the adults in the room have created a massive inflation. The adults in the room are looking at $5, $6, $7, $8 of gas for a gallon. The adults in the room have created food shortages. The adults in the room are looking to start all kinds of wars, and we are on the brink of hot war, nuclear war with Russia, and we are edging closer to a huge conflict even with China. The adults in the room have created a baby food shortages. The adults in the room are massively printing money and collapsing our currency. So should I keep going on in terms of Joe Biden's agenda and the adults in the room? The adults in the room are increasingly normalizing transgender ideology in our elementary schools and pre-Ks, even starting with 3-year-olds. The adults in the room are looking at our military, our strongest military in the world, as a social experiment of wokeism. And the adults in the room are confusing people about which bathroom to use. And the adults in the room have actually convinced people that women don't only give birth, that also men give birth, and that we have birthing people. And the adults in the room had convinced us that men can get pregnant, and the adults in the room cannot define what a woman is. So this is just few things that I have to pick a bone with. So if there's anybody out there that is still supporting this, I really must say we should examine their mental health, Democrat or Republican. It really is not about that anymore. So I think just from all of these things that I've listed, if there's still really support out there, I truly wonder where we are as a society and what kind of a bleak future we're looking at. And I'll tell you, all joking aside, but these are very serious issues. Democrats really do have a problem on their hand, and I'm hearing whispers of possibly President Joe Biden not even finishing his term, but they are trying to figure out how to create this transition without Kamala Harris coming to power. So, I mean, they're as much as we think they're unified and monolith, this is very, very difficult time for them, even heading into this November.
Now, I don't think that Democrats realize it, but, everything that you named, everything that you listed has to be Joe Biden's agenda because it is his legacy.
Ultimately, yes. So, I mean, you have to pin it on him. There's nobody else that you can pin it on because they would be very quick to pin all of this on President Trump. Exactly. And see, this is interesting. So they blamed President Trump for all of the violence and rage that was promulgated by Antifa and BLM. Well, now this is a very touchy subject for the Democrats because if we take them as an extended tool of power of the Democrat Party, and if they start burning the cities right now, as we kind of are seeing what's happening overnight with Roe Wade, and you have, I mean, obviously we're seeing Antifa out there because they are not out there only screaming about abortion rights. They're out there screaming against the police. They're burning the American flags in these different cities. This is not a good look now for the Democrats because can they keep their, I'd call them dogs of violence, under control? Because sometimes, we create these monsters, but the monsters tend to have minds of their own. And I don't know if this is going to be a very good look for them if we indeed are headed into some sort of violence.
Well,
because the only blame we can place this on is the Democrats and President Joe Biden.
From the point of view as a security expert who's fully versed in this, violence, terrorism, etc., would you classify Antifa and BLM as militant wings of the Democratic Party?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, let's unpack this. So, based on white papers and memos that circulated, particularly after 2020, from the DOJ, from the FBI, from Homeland Security, and I have those white papers and we certainly closely look at them. Based on the criteria that they set for classifying militant groups, even domestic terrorist organizations, yes, Antifa and BLM certainly fulfilled that criteria. When it comes to Antifa, they actually, if we look at some of the protests around the world, including London and elsewhere, Antifa could potentially even fall under the guise of an international or foreign terrorist organization. So
I actually found their leadership, their political leadership in Germany.
Okay, so there we go. So essentially, from my own point of view as a security expert, I certainly would classify them as a national security threat, as militant indeed, very violent, and obviously we are looking at, for now, let's say circumstantial evidence that they are a tool of the Democrat Party. So indeed, yes, I would be at liberty to classify them as such. However, I don't think we are there. The reason why I brought up some of these white papers and these classifications, especially after 2020, were set up to fit the organizations such as Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, and all of this narrative about white nationalism that is allegedly rampant, right. and we all need to be afraid of white men. However, the evidence points in a different direction. So based on their classifications and based on what we know as security experts of international and domestic terrorism, yes, absolutely. They fulfill all the criteria. Now, would they be designated as such? Again, that is a great question. But based on counterterrorism laws that we can look at, based on everything that I certainly myself have learned throughout my career, yes, we could certainly codify them according to that criteria.
And if it's not rolled back, and, from my perspective, it's going to take Donald Trump running again, winning, to roll all this back. If this type of organized political violence isn't rolled back, do you think it's going to be the future of American politics?
I believe what we are going to experience in the future, and I am not trying to be pessimistic, but I think we are headed towards a sort of breakdown of society simply because of the measurable elements that we are looking at in terms of our economic positioning right now, our fiat currency, the polarization within the population, and a certain element of violence that is being promulgated by an establishment political elite, or that is being encouraged and justified. And I actually, again, just saw it last night in the likes of Maxine Waters, for example, representative from California. I've seen it from other Democrat representatives from other states, that they are justifying, even including Chuck Schumer, who are going out. And if, let's say, Donald Trump said something like this, and he said far less on January 6th, and you see what we're going through with the January 6th commission and with the hearings and with this entire charade. And if we remember, and if I can paraphrase, he said, go home peacefully. What Maxine Waters has done in 2020, while the cities were burning, were legitimate calls to violence. What she's doing yesterday, Ocasio-Cortez, Chuck Schumer, these are legitimate, you could say, if you were objective, calls for justification of violence. So is this the future of American politics? It seems so, because it is justified and encouraged by one political entity. Now, how much longer can the American people take this? Because you put them on the brink of existence. They can't pump gas in their car to get to the workplace. The workplace is not paying them enough. So what is the future? The future certainly looks bleak, and I do predict some sort of breakdown of our civil society, and that certainly is going to be a foreseeable future in American politics. But I almost feel that, I hate to say it, but it's a good thing, because somewhere we need to have like this break and a collapse of some sort, and then rebuilding, because we certainly need to uproot the system that has isolated the American people, and the American people need to take back reins of their own country and of their own future, whether it's political or any other.